I'm Barbara J. Hunt, and I'm a self-confessed forgiveness nerd, or as I like to say in public, specialist. But I'm always been fascinated with this subject, and it became more of a serious interest probably about 10 years ago when I was working on a retreat, and I was really interested in what helped people to forgive and what made the difference between the people who were somehow more able to forgive and the people who weren't, because there didn't seem to be a correlation between the things that had happened which you would think would cause somebody to find it difficult to forgive. So I got really interested in the whole subject, wrote my book Forgiveness Made Easy, and also started hosting online forgiveness fields, and I call them forgiveness fields for two reasons. One is the lovely Charles Eisenstein idea that there's a field, so whenever people they find the way to forgiveness one way or the other, that it somehow adds to forgiveness, and in the field there's a resonance that it adds to. And then also that beautiful Rumi quote that says, out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field, I'll meet you there. And we have to sort of get beyond our own personal perspective to be able to forgive. And I was just talking to Deanie about it at the beginning before we started the call, and just how challenging it can be for us to find our way to forgiveness, for good reasons, because often really difficult things have happened and we need to forgive them. But then there's also the daily things that need to be forgiven. And I host online forgiveness fields, which are like a practice place, like you would come to a yoga class and do a class of yoga. The same with forgiveness, because although people have different experiences, sometimes it's a journey. So you might find your way towards forgiveness. There may be grace. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes people just manage to find their own way to forgiveness. Other people need a lot of support. Other people need a long time. Other people need a long run up and then support. So everyone's different in their journey. And what I was continue to be fascinated in, and what made me write my book really, was to look at what the obstacles are. What are the things that are in our way? And so what I thought would be helpful would be if I outlined briefly those obstacles, so that at least what might be in the way. And then I'd love it to be more interactive anyway. So if you have questions, do put them in the chat, because I can usually fold them into what it is that I want to talk about. And I feel like I'm on a bit of a mission at the moment, because from everything that I see in the world and the way the world is, it seems to me that forgiveness is a key practice, mental and emotional well-being practice, relational practice, and has potential to change things. But we have to really get under the hood of, why don't we forgive? Why do we find it so hard? Why culturally do we have wars that transcend generations? Because that's what we're witnessing right now. We're seeing, and even in the way society has divided itself along different lines, different groups of people, different ideologies, different belief systems, and all of this in its resentment. And that's what we need to call it. It's resentment of the other, like wishing that they were different, or wishing that they'd see things the way we see them, and holding on to that, even though when we hold our resentment, it doesn't actually change the situation. And again, I was saying to Deanie, it doesn't matter how hard you hold on to your resentment, like you're holding on to the grudges and gripes and grievances of everyday life, and you're gathering them up, all the things that people do wrong, and your judgments of other people, and this is the kind of pile of stuff that you end up holding. And so I can hold this for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Has anything changed? No. Are my arms tired? Yes. Do I wish it was different? Yes, passionately wish it was different. Am I making any difference at all holding on to my resentment? No. Thank you for participating. So the definition, just at the very top of the call, I like to talk about the definition that I use of forgiveness, because this is one of the obstacles actually, is, well, what do we really mean? What is forgiveness? And one of my very first teachers said that forgiveness, I'm just going to add some more. Forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone for what they did or didn't do. So the absolute refusal looks like this. That's how you do it. You choose to let it go. And it doesn't mean that it's easy, because it isn't easy, which is why I call my book Forgiveness Made Easy, or Made Easier, probably is a bit more accurate, because we need help to be willing to do that letting go. And knowing that you're holding on to something that's a really important part, because we need to know that we've got something in the first place, because a lot of the time we're in denial. We have all this, we're holding on to it. And then, if you said, are you resenting your mother? No, she did the best she could. No, she did the best, and then you've got all this, all these hurts and the pain and the, remembering all the things that didn't go the way you wanted them to go. So there's a lot inside of us. And one of the first things that we need to do is to be really honest about our forgiveness, about the fact that we don't forgive, and that maybe it would be a good idea if we did, and that we're holding resentment. Especially if we're on any kind of personal or spiritual development path, we tend to prefer to overlook those things and understand them. We can be very understanding, as opposed to admitting, yeah, actually I'm full of resentment of all these different people. And so about 30 years ago, I was doing a personal development training, and they invited us to write down the names of all the people that we felt like we were holding some kind of grudge or gripe or grievance against. And I quite like the idea that there's a spectrum, because there's some things that are really damaging, traumatic, challenging, like events that happen in our lives that change us, and those things that need to be forgiven. And then there's maybe the less traumatic, but still things that we wish hadn't happened. Somebody's mean or unkind, or there's lots of different levels of grievance. And it can be the really petty, which is why I always have this, which are all the why don't you put the lid on the toothpaste, and will you pick up your shoes, and why can't you do blah blah blah. It's always, if you were different, I'd be happy. If you were doing something different, then I wouldn't have this grievance. So why don't you change? But of course, those of us who've lived like more than 10 minutes know that you can't change other people. Even your children, you have a certain amount of power over them when they're little, because you can lift them up and move them. But after a while, that doesn't work. And even if you do lift them up and move them, they still protest. But so that there's this idea that we're always holding on to a reality where we want it to be different from the way it is, which is technically a waste of our time, because it can't be different from the way it is. It just is the way it is. So how do we then maneuver ourselves to find a way of being at peace with the outrageous fortune that may have happened, or the things that have happened? And when something bad happens, it's like there's like on the scales of life, because all of us have this internal idea about things should be fair, even though we know they're not. And from about the age of 4, you realize that things are not fair, because your sister or your brother do not get the same treatment as you do. So, but there's an internal reckoning that we have. And we even have a phrase for it. When something happens, we say we want to get even. We want to balance it back up again. And the getting even, we want the other person to know what it's like for us. We want them to know what the experience is that we're having. If they've hurt us, back to the kids, you bash your brother, he bashes you back, you bash him back, and then eventually, usually a parent or somebody will come and separate you. But there's this kind of like tit for tat, like you did that to me, so I'm going to do that to you. So that's this mechanism of balancing up. And so what happens when you can't get the other person to experience what you've experienced? And if you're choosing to forgive, then you're not going to exact any kind of revenge or retribution. And one of the things that's really important to talk about is that forgiveness is not about waiving boundaries or saying that everything is okay. You have to be really clear. You can keep very clear boundaries. I can still go to court with all my resentment and divorce my husband, or I can do it with love in my heart and just say, honey, we're at the end of our relationship. Let's separate. How can we do that in a sane way? So resentment isn't, it's not necessary for anything really that we do. And it does serve certain functions, but we don't have to have it. It doesn't create boundaries. We can create boundaries with or without resentment. But this sense of trying to even things up, we want to make it feel okay inside of ourselves. And sometimes we wait for the other person to acknowledge what we've done, or to apologize. You know, we want some kind of amends from the other person that will do that. And then of course sometimes we don't have that option because the other person dies or isn't in contact with us anymore, or it's too dangerous for us to actually seek that kind of connection with the other person. And so then what do you do with that sense of, well, this is out of balance? You know, how do I make it okay? And that's why I teach forgiveness as an internal practice, something that we do inside our own hearts. And it may be that when I've done my forgiveness work, so I've let go of all my resentment, it may be that I still need to have a conversation with you about something. There may be one thing, actually, this is really important to our relationship, and can we have a conversation about that, as opposed to all of this, which is all of my resentment, which you're probably not that interested in because it's quite petty. And you know, the fact that you don't put the lid on the toothpaste is like, is that really the most important thing that we need to have a conversation, or is there a need that's not being met that's really important for us to talk about? So hopefully that's clear, just sort of like the territory that we're in. And if you have any questions so far, just, or you need any clarification, putting them in the chat. I mean, what I can do actually, why don't I type in the definition just so that you've got that, because it's really wonderful, from K. Bradford Brown. And it's absolute refusal to hold ill will, and that could be a grief and a gripe, you know, whatever, you know, that whole spectrum, against someone. And this can be someone or something, because sometimes we have resentments of groups of people. And again, when we look at the global picture, there can be grievances about groups of people. So it could be someone or something. And it, again, for what they did or didn't do, because especially when we're children, sometimes the pain is things that weren't done, things where we were neglected. So forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone or something for what they did or didn't do. So that, I think, in and of itself is incredibly helpful to have clarification, because forgiveness can be very vague. And there's even a book, quite a famous book on forgiveness, called Forgiveness is Really Strange, which I think isn't very, I mean, it's great to have stories and to see it like a kind of mystery, which sometimes it can be, but also I think it's helpful to try and pin it down so that we can then do something about it, because otherwise forgiveness is a bit like a random act of, you know, grace. And some of us may not want to wait that long, because bit like you get lucky by, you know, practicing certain things. You know, the more you practice, the luckier you get. You know, one of those things. So that's the first obstacle. The first obstacle is having a definition that works, so you know what forgiveness is, and also to talk about what it isn't. So it's not condoning unacceptable behavior. It's not, you know, turning a blind eye to things that you should actually call out or take someone, you know, to court over. It's not a way of excusing your behavior either, because sometimes when we don't forgive somebody else, we justify our own behavior. And forgiveness is not a weaker position. Actually, forgiveness is really hard. Forgiveness is, I think, it's a master spiritual practice. It's not something that we find easy, which is why we don't do it. There's such a lot of under the hood complicated things going on that means it's difficult for us to forgive. And we need to see that and recognize it, and that helps us to then choose to let go when, when we're ready. And although I am an advocate and a definitely a fan of forgiveness, to put it mildly, I do think it's like a transformational potential, has transformational potential. But I don't ever insist that anybody does it. I just trying to make it as irresistible as possible for people to think about it in a different way, and then to perhaps engage in it. But of course, you're completely free to die with your arms full of resentment and go out with a grimace in, yeah. I mean, that's the, you have the option. You don't have to let go, but you can. So that the first obstacle is really knowing what forgiveness is and what it isn't. Then the second is the really the fear that we have of it being a weaker position. So it's the vulnerability that we don't want. And Brené Brown has done fantastic work about vulnerability and shame. But if you think about holding resentment, it's a bit like a nice kind of scab, if you like, over the heart. It hardens the heart. It's ill will, held over time for good reason. So you're holding on to it, and it's like cold anger. And so it sort of acts like a protection. And I think this is really important, because this is the most common reason why we find it hard to let go, is that we're afraid that if we let our resentment go away from our hearts, that actually we're exposed, and then we feel vulnerable. So we'll feel the pain. And recently I've been talking about forgiveness and grief as siblings, that they come together. That if I hold on to my resentment, then that can be slightly more palatable to me than opening my heart and feeling maybe some grief, the thing that I've lost, the thing that didn't go the way I wanted it to. But also equally, if you're holding your resentment, it may be that underneath that you're not letting yourself grieve because you can't forgive something, because you've got this. So it's almost like your heart doesn't open to your grief because you've still got resentment in there. And it can be a very tender undoing. And in fact, often when we're talking about forgiveness in general, there are 3 different strands to it. One is me needing to forgive the people who have transgressed against me. Then there's also me needing forgiveness from sometimes those people. As much as I'm resenting them, they may have reason to resent me, especially in long-term relationships or family relationships. There may be as much that I need to be asking for forgiveness for. And then there's self-forgiveness. And so again, they're like plaited together in the heart. So as you're doing your forgiveness work, you may realize there are things I need to apologize for. There are things that I need to make amends for, even as you're working on your forgiveness of somebody else. And I need to forgive myself as well. And just a little thing about self-forgiveness is sometimes people say, oh, is it important? You have to be able to forgive yourself first before you can forgive somebody else. And I don't ever put that in place, because then, we could be waiting for a while for. So any forgiveness, start anywhere, do what's easy. If you feel actually, yeah, I can forgive that childhood friend, I can go there, do that, and then, get towards self-forgiveness. And sometimes self-forgiveness can be the hardest one. So the second obstacle really is this fear of vulnerability, that somehow, well, if I forgive, is that like saying it's okay, or I'm letting people get one over on me, or it's the weaker position. But forgiveness isn't about staying in unhealthy relationships, or not having healthy boundaries, or not calling people on their behavior. Forgiveness, it is about having an open heart to what has happened, to letting yourself grieve the pain, to feeling the feelings that have come up. And that can be really hard. And sometimes maybe not even a good idea to do it on your own. Maybe you need to be in a group of people to do that work, or you need a therapist, or you need somebody to work with you so that you can access those tender feelings that are underneath the resentment. But it's a really important part, because we can be compassionate with ourselves about how the resentment might have served us. Because although the next obstacle, which we'll go on to, is about the ego, that's a bit more, what's the word? suspect. Whereas I think this self-protection is a very genuine and sometimes a very healthy coping mechanism. And one of the things I tell a story about my own journey with forgiveness was when I was at the first training where I learnt about forgiveness. We were invited to write down our list of everybody that we resented. And I thought, well, I'll lower my bar to include pretty much everyone I've ever met. Not that I'd thought of myself as a resentful person. I thought of myself as a very nice, personal development type person. But I just thought, well, let's just get honest. So pretty much everyone. And then I got to number 36 and I thought, yeah, probably resent my mum as well, put her name down. And what was significant about my mum was that she had multiple sclerosis from the time I was 15. And so that massively impacted the whole family and her relationship with me and, and our relationship as mother and daughter. And actually, by the time I was 20, I'd come back from university and I was looking after her. So there was kind of like a role reversal. And so this resentment of my mum actually was probably quite a smart move because I didn't have the emotional maturity to grieve a woman who was still alive but wasn't being my mum. That's way too complex when you're 15. And so the easiest thing was to shut it down. And I used to wear this little badge that said, je ne regrette rien, and I didn't cry for 7 years. I'm like, I can handle this. And so there's this sort of the shutting down, and you might not call it resentment, but actually it is a resentment because I wanted it to be different. I was angry with her for not trying harder to get well, even though it wasn't her fault that she was ill and she was trying, but she didn't get well. So it's like, so you're hiding all of these feelings underneath this very intelligent coping mechanism, as Thomas Hubel refers to the way we adapt as we grow up. But then when I'm trying to fall in love or have a relationship or friendships or feel anything, there's this resentment inside and it's shutting down my heart. So that's why the vulnerability is necessary, perhaps for a long time. If there's been a lot of trauma, maybe you need to hold on to the resentment, the protection for a while until you have the emotional resources, the inner resources to choose, or with support to let it go, where you can be restored and do whatever it is that you need to do therapeutically to have that happen. That's the second obstacle, is vulnerability. The third is the ego, and this is where it gets a little bit more sniffy, because we do, with this our balancing act, we like to judge other people and feel superior to them if we can, and we like to have the moral high ground, and who doesn't love to be right? And even especially when we're doubting ourselves, when we proved right by somebody else's reprehensible behavior, we feel we're on the high horse and we love it up there. So there are lots of things that go on with our ego and our resentment and the things that we get out of the resentment. And again, this can be very hidden material. And this is often the thing that people find hardest to do, is to really genuinely look at what's my part in this. How am I being served by my resentment? And that's why this is like the kind of vulnerability thing is easy to understand, and we can be compassionate with ourselves about that. But then the other things, like, well, and I did do this with my mom, was my resentment helped me to have a martyr, like what a marvelous daughter I was to take a year off to look after my mum. But of course, you can't ask me to do anything complicated like finish my degree or, because I'm looking after my mum. So I kind of used my resentment as a way, and the circumstances as an excuse for my avoidant behavior. And so being willing to at least question and say to yourself, am I being a martyr here, or am I being a victim here? And using that to excuse me from taking radical action. Sometimes we stay in relationships longer than we should because we're holding the resentment, and we think we can stay in and just resent the person, and maybe if we resent them enough, they'll change and be more like the way we want them. And Sue says, my granddaughter Helen is still here but not able to be herself since she became severely brain injured. New normal. Yeah, you see, and that's the sort of thing where to admit to any resentment around it would look like that's a what an awful woman to, to have, but actually the truth is that if you have those like devastating circumstances that change your life as well, there is, there is that sense of, you know we have to be honest that there may be some resentment in there, and also grief, because again, this is a bit of a muddle in there, and what I'm interested in is what's going on in the heart as well as in the head, because we make meaning about things and what the consequences are going to be. So we're always adding to our own misery. But, and sometimes there are very challenging circumstances that involve our grieving. And again, like I said, sometimes it's easier to hold a little bit of resentment because it stops us from fully feeling the extent of our pain. The ego is more sneaky, and as I was saying, like the moral high ground, justifying our behavior. So I can steal the stationery from the office because my boss is an idiot. So we can use our resentment to justify our behavior, or especially more now culturally, those people who don't think like us. We can point the finger and have a sense of moral superiority and call them them, they, rather than acknowledging our common humanity. And so there's I mean, I won't go into it much more, but it's in my book, so if you're interested, there's a bit more about ego in there. And then the fourth obstacle is again more of an exploration into not only what do we get out of holding the resentment, because there are payoffs. So resentment is a bit addictive. Sometimes we can bond with people over our resentments. That it has a bit of an addictive quality to it. And if it's justifying our behavior and we're getting away with things, or we're doing things that we want to do, or we feel like we have the moral high ground, we use all of that, we get something out of it. And ultimately, and Brené Brown says this, she says, resentment goes down like a milkshake, but burns your insides like battery acid. There are downsides to holding the resentment. So at the moment, it looks like it's all good. You're getting, great things from holding your resentment. You're getting a sense of power, or you're getting the upper hand, or you're getting an excuse for doing things that you want to do, or you're protecting your heart, all these seemingly positive benefits. But actually there are massive downsides to holding resentment, and they're hard to see. This is often when I work one-to-one with people, this is what's hard for people to discern, is what's the downside of holding on to resentment against somebody. And sometimes when I ask, what are you getting out of holding on to your resentment? Why are you not letting it go? What's the benefit to you? People will say nothing. And that's obviously because it's hard to see. It's hard to see and it's hard to admit. But likewise, when I say, what's the downside? Sometimes people find it hard to see that there's a downside, especially if they've been really hurt. But there are downsides, and there are downsides physiologically, because if you're carrying a resentment, you're carrying old material. And the definition of resentment, when you break it down to its etymology, comes from the Latin sentire, which means to feel. So resentment, re-feeling, it means you're feeling the feelings over and over. That means that you are going to bed with that person on your mind in thinking about the thing, and then wake up with it. So you're feeling those feelings again and again. And more and more scientific studies are showing the detrimental impact of, adverse childhood experiences, but also the fact that you're not able to work through that material or get to forgiveness. And there have been studies showing the difference that forgiveness can make on heart health, lowering blood pressure, lowering cortisol levels, gut health, even the progression of melanoma, which is amazing. So being able to actually shift those old stuck emotions out of your system can be really beneficial for your health. So if you think about the downside of holding the resentment, is it's costing you in your health. If I've got this protection over my heart, I've got this resentment that I'm carrying, it's going to impact my relationships. It's going to impact the depth to which I can have intimacy, and not just with the person concerned, but with all people, because a bit like the guide on your printer, if you pull one side in, the other side goes in as well. You can't just do one side. You can't just, keep the good stuff and not the bad stuff. It's like if you close your heart, it's a bit more closed. And we don't notice that. We don't notice that our resentment might be affecting our sleep, or we're grinding our teeth at night, or that that we're carrying tension in our body. We just think, oh well, it's modern life and it's there's tension. But what if quite a lot of it was because of your resentments, and you could choose to let it go if you could work through it. And there's physiological, there's relational, there's also personal reasons why that carrying a resentment might be difficult and detrimental to you. So do you really want to be somebody who gets off point scoring other people, and making other people smaller so that you can feel good about yourself, or having the moral high ground? I think that costs us in our integrity and in our humanity and in our humility. There's something about the whole judging others. When we do judge, and you need to be discerning, but there's this sense of making somebody else wrong and then writing them off otherwise, rather than looking on the back of somebody's ingredient packet and realizing, oh, well, they make sense. If you knew that this person lost their mum when they were 3, or this happened when they were 4, or these different life events or these different circumstances that they had, we might be a bit more compassionate about how we judge others. And all of this material, so understanding what we're getting out of our resentment and understanding the downsides, all of that is completely hidden. We're not aware of it. We don't discuss it, but that means that it perpetuates. And that's the trouble in the world, in my opinion, is that we're holding on to resentment and we're perpetuating resentment. And we're not realizing that it has any massive benefit to us, that we're addicted to it, but also that it has downsides. Because how can you come to a place of peace in the world if we're just going to insist on continuing to resent each other? So that's the fourth of our major obstacles to forgiveness. And then the last one is know-how, is knowing how to do it, because it's such a strange thing to want to do. It's an undoing, it's a non-doing, it's a letting go. And usually at that point, you're in the field of letting go of an addiction, of surrendering something. And it's a really hard thing. One of the things that I learned on that very first weekend, when I was learning about forgiveness, they taught about how you trap a monkey. And you put like a little sweetmeat in a gourd or a jar, and the monkey puts its hand in and holds onto the sweetie, and it won't let go. And the only way it can get its hand out is if it lets go, and then its hand's small enough to get out, but it won't let go. It will keep holding on because it wants the thing, and it keeps holding on. And then that's how you catch a monkey. And we're like that. We keep holding on because we don't realize that we're going to get caught, that there's going to be any downside. We want to hold on. And the letting go is incredibly subtle ground. And although I do have a spiritual life, I teach this as if I don't have a spiritual life, because I want to make it available as a secular ethics practice. You don't have to have a particular faith, even though forgiveness is in every kind of religion, in all the major traditions. But I don't want to make it dependent on you believing in anything. I'm talking about it as a mental health practice, as a personal and spiritual development practice, and as a transformational practice for your relationships, all of your relationships, as well as the potential to transform the world. And I'm not being naive about that, because it does have that potential. There was a beautiful quote by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said, "Without forgiveness, there really is no future." And as far as I'm concerned, unless we learn how to do this essential master spiritual practice or master secular ethics practice, we really are not going to be able to overcome our differences to start taking care of the whole world. We need to say, how do we make the world work for everyone, not just these people that I agree with, or these people who, I don't mind, but all of us, how do we get to that? And the only way we can get to that is if we do our forgiveness work. And when I was writing my book, I felt like I'd had an epiphany, like this is the secret to global peace. All we need to do is just like make everyone, like that's going to work, make everyone do their forgiveness work, and because truly, if everyone did take the time, and even if you had a big list like me, 36 people or whatever, you could work through it. Maybe it'd take you, a month or something. But if you were really deciding, actually, I want to get rid of all of my ill will that I've been carrying against anyone, I'm going to do the work, you could do it quite quickly, which technically means by the summer, we could be living in a completely different world. And I find that such a tantalizing and tragic potential, because it's really unlikely that it'll happen, but it's still the potential. And so all the best thing I can do is I can be honest about my resentment. So I keep a list in the back of my book. I have a little list of the people that, just recently I was just thinking, oh God, I need to put her on my list again. And even, and this is the power of having a practice. Even as I was driving to the hospital on the day my brother died, I was doing forgiveness work on some family members who didn't have the same view as I did about his care. That is the power of having a forgiveness practice, because if I can clear my field when I'm then in that very tender moment of his death, I'm fully present without my resentment. And that's powerful, and when you move, like when you do your forgiveness work, it's extraordinary. And I can't tell you how many times this has happened. When I used to work on a retreat, we were with the clients for 7 days, and we do some forgiveness work, maybe at the beginning of the week, and then halfway through they'd say, you'll never guess what. And I'd say, maybe what? And they'd say, oh, my sister, she phoned me out of the blue, and we'd done some forgiveness work earlier that week on her sister. That kind of thing would happen all the time, that when you do your forgiveness work, it changes the quality of the relationship. And it doesn't mean that you have to reconcile with people, and if you've been abused, you don't go back into a relationship, you keep your boundaries, but it changes something. And because we don't really have a way of articulating what those things are, because it sounds a bit woo-woo, it's the energy between us, or but there's something in a transmission. If you think about how a relationship is built, it's built by exchanges between you, kind words, actions, things that happen. And so when you do something different and you choose to let go of your ill will, your resentment, your I wish you were different, something changes. The other person weirdly knows you've done it, and it changes something. And it's even better, sometimes I work with couples, even better if they both do their forgiveness work individually with me, and then that is the most powerful kind of solution, if you like, to challenges in a marriage or a relationship, to be able to do each side. That's really wonderful. But unilaterally, it's pretty powerful. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to ask, but that basically the know-how. Oh yes, so the last part of the know-how is that in my book I've created a 7-step forgiveness made easy process. So there's work that needs to be done up to make you ready to kind of like to understand all of this. Helps you to think, actually, I think I do want to do some forgiveness work. That's where I'm trying to get people to before they come, and then either work with me one-to-one or in a forgiveness field. And the forgiveness fields are like an open space, a practice space, and where you come and you can do some forgiveness work. So I have a theme usually. So the last theme I had was grief and forgiveness, and this next one is self-forgiveness, because I do approach that slightly differently. I do slightly different things, but I make these experiential. So I'm not just like today I'm talking about forgiveness. This is like the bit, to talk about it so that you understand why it might be a good idea to have it as a practice or to take it as a practice. And then the actual practice it's a 90. Oh, that's weird. You might need a small b.
I'll go test it and read.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So to be able to actually do a practice, to be able to do a 7-step, taking it, and it's done it as like I do it like a guided visualization, and you work with your microphone off in a group field. So it's really powerful to do work together in a group, because it means that we're all going, yes, actually I have got some resentment and I really want to let it go, and we're doing it together. And I take the whole group step by step through the 7 steps. And it's really brilliant to work with your microphones off, because that means you're free to express, but you're not overheard, so you don't have to think, oh god, should I say that? It's like, so but you as long as you don't feel overheard in your home environment. But it's a really lovely way of working together. And because most people have, do have resentments, and from my point of view, it means if I have a practice, then I can keep doing it. If I come once a month to the practice, then it means that I can just clear my field, oh, that person or these circumstances. So that's that I my vision of them is like an online yoga class or a dojo, where we're coming together to do spiritual practice. And it feels to me like sacred work, because the choice to let go is really probably this also the definition of unconditional love, because it's not conditional on anything. It's not conditional on if you apologize, or if you do that, or if that. It's you choosing to let go because you choose to let go, and regardless of what the other person does or doesn't do. And that's very powerful position to be in. And not that it's all about power, but just, if you want to feel good about yourself, being able to do that is profound.